Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Speak Up, the podcast where we help you improve your English skills one step at a time. I'm Ryan, and today we have an exciting topic that I think is going to really resonate with all of you language learners out there. But before we dive into it, let me introduce my co-host, the brilliant Priya. Priya, how are you doing today?
Thanks, Ryan. I'm doing really well and super excited about today's topic. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Speak Up. If you're new here, this is the podcast that's all about giving you practical advice and real-world strategies to help you learn English, or any language, in a way that's fun, effective, and tailored to your needs. And if you've been with us before, thank you for tuning in again. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Ryan, today's topic is such a good one. Podcasts are such a powerful tool for language learning, but not everyone knows just how useful they can be. What do you think?
Absolutely, Priya. Podcasts are one of the best tools for learning a new language, and that's what we're diving into today. In this episode, we're going to break down exactly why podcasts are so effective for improving your listening skills, expanding your vocabulary, and even perfecting your pronunciation. And the best part? You can do all of this while multitasking, whether you're driving, working out, or even just relaxing at home. We'll also share some tips on how to pick the right podcasts for your level, strategies to get the most out of your listening, and a few success stories from language learners who've used podcasts to reach their goals. So, if you've ever wondered how to turn your favorite shows into powerful language tools, you're in the right place.
That's so true, Ryan. By the end of this episode, you'll not only understand the unique role podcasts play in language learning, but also walk away with actionable steps you can use right away. We'll be talking about things like active listening, using transcripts effectively, and even how to tackle challenges like understanding fast speech or unfamiliar accents. So, whether you're just starting out or looking for ways to take your skills to the next level, this episode has got you covered. It's going to be packed with tips and strategies that you can apply no matter where you are in your language learning journey. So let's not waste any more time. Are you ready to dive in, Ryan?
All right, let's dive into our first segment, understanding how podcasts can actually help in learning a new language. You know, Priya, a lot of people underestimate the power of just listening to conversations or discussions in a target language. Podcasts are an amazing resource because they offer something that's very different from traditional classroom methods. When you're listening to a podcast, you're getting real-life language exposure. This means you're hearing how words and phrases are used naturally, in context by native speakers. And here's the key. It's not just about memorizing grammar rules or vocabulary lists. It's about developing an ear for the language. What do you think, Priya?
That's such a good point, Ryan. One thing I'd add is that podcasts also allow you to hear a variety of accents, tones, and speaking speeds, which is so important. In a classroom or with a tutor, you might only get used to one accent or one way of speaking. But when you listen to podcasts, you expose yourself to a much broader range. For example, you might hear conversational English on one podcast, professional or business English on another, and even storytelling styles on a different show. This variety really helps you adapt to the way English is used in real life. And let's not forget, Ryan, that podcasts also help you improve your listening comprehension in a way that's really practical. When you're listening to a natural conversation, you learn to pick up keywords and phrases even when you don't understand every single word. What's your experience with that?
Exactly, Priya. And that's where podcasts really shine. They teach you to focus on context. For instance, even if a listener doesn't catch every word or phrase in a podcast, they can still get the overall meaning of what's being said based on the tone, the pauses, or even the way certain words are repeated for emphasis. And here's another thing. Podcasts mimic real-world conversations much more closely than textbook dialogues. Think about it. When you're listening to a podcast, you're hearing how people actually talk with natural pauses. Fillers like and you know, and expressions that might not be in textbooks. This makes it easier to transition from being a passive learner to actually participating in conversations. Priya, how do you think this compares to more traditional learning methods?
You're absolutely right, Ryan. Traditional methods like textbooks or even language apps often give you a very controlled environment, which is helpful for building a foundation. But podcasts, they add that real-life element. For example, imagine someone learning English listens to a podcast episode about travel. They'll hear phrases like, "Where can I catch a cab?" or "What's the best place to eat around here?" in a natural, conversational tone. Now, compare that to just reading those phrases in a textbook. The difference is huge because podcasts show you how to say these things in context. How fast or slow to speak, the tone to use, and even the little cultural nuances that go along with it. And the best part? You can rewind and listen as many times as you need to. Ryan, do you think this flexibility is what makes podcasts so appealing?
Absolutely, Priya. And flexibility is a major advantage. Unlike a live class or even a video lesson, you can listen to podcasts anytime, anywhere. Whether you're on your morning commute, cooking dinner, or taking a walk, you can make podcasts a seamless part of your daily routine. And this constant exposure is what helps language learners move forward. The more you hear the language, the more comfortable you become with its rhythm, vocabulary, and structure. Plus, as you said, you can always rewind or slow down the playback speed if a part feels too challenging. And speaking of challenges, I think podcasts also push learners to stay consistent, don't you think?
Yes, consistency is key, Ryan. Podcasts help learners build a habit of engaging with the language every day, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes. Over time, this adds up and makes a huge difference. What's even better is that they're not just learning. They're enjoying the process. Listening to a podcast you actually like keeps you motivated. For example, someone interested in technology could listen to a tech podcast in English. Not only are they improving their language skills, but they're also learning about a topic they're passionate about. This makes language learning feel less like a chore and more like something fun and meaningful. Ryan, would you agree that this element of enjoyment is what sets podcasts apart?
Absolutely, Priya. Podcasts combine learning and enjoyment in a way that's hard to beat. They help learners stay engaged, provide practical exposure to real-life language, and fit seamlessly into a busy lifestyle. Whether it's learning conversational phrases, picking up cultural nuances, or simply getting used to the sound of the language, podcasts are an incredible tool. And that's exactly why we're talking about them today, because they're not just a resource, they're a game changer for anyone serious about learning a new language. Now that we've explored how podcasts help in language learning, let's dive into our second segment, the different types of podcasts available for language learners. You know, Priya, there's such a wide variety out there, and choosing the right type can make all the difference. Some podcasts are specifically designed for learners, like English learning podcasts, which focus on vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Others are more general interest podcasts that native speakers listen to, things like news, interviews, or storytelling podcasts. Each type has its own benefits. What's your take on this, Priya?
Great point, Ryan. The variety of podcasts really allows learners to tailor their experience. Let's start with the first category, podcasts designed specifically for language learners. These are often slower paced, with clear pronunciation and simple vocabulary. They're perfect for beginners because they break things down step by step, and many of them even include explanations in the learner's native language. For example, a podcast might teach you phrases like, "How's the weather?" and explain the meaning and context before using it in a sentence. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, we have general interest podcasts. These are amazing for advanced learners because they give you exposure to how native speakers naturally talk about everyday topics. Ryan, do you think learners should stick to one type, or is there a benefit to mixing them?
Oh, definitely. Mixing them is the way to go. Each type of podcast brings something unique to the table. For instance, if you're a beginner, starting with learner-focused podcasts can build your confidence because the content is tailored to your level. But as you progress, switching to general interest podcasts helps you challenge yourself and move closer to fluency. Take news podcasts, for example. They're great for intermediate learners because they use clear and formal language while covering a wide range of topics. Then there are storytelling podcasts, which are fantastic for learning descriptive language and picking up on emotions or tones. Priya, do you have a favorite podcast type for learners who want to work on their speaking skills?
I do, Ryan. Conversation-based podcasts are fantastic for improving speaking skills. These podcasts often feature 2 or more hosts having casual discussions, much like the way we're talking now. By listening to these, learners can pick up on conversational cues such as how to ask questions, how to agree or disagree politely, and even how to express emotions naturally. What's more, these podcasts often cover relatable topics like travel, hobbies, or current events, so the language feels relevant and useful. And here's a tip. Learners can pause the podcast, repeat a phrase, and try to mimic the tone and pronunciation. This shadowing technique really helps. Ryan, how do you think learners can use storytelling podcasts effectively?
Storytelling podcasts are a hidden gem for language learners, Priya. They're not only entertaining, but also a great way to learn descriptive language and improve listening comprehension. Stories often include a lot of adjectives, idiomatic expressions, and natural pauses, which make them perfect for learning context-based vocabulary. For example, in a story about a picnic, you might hear phrases like a gentle breeze, crispy sandwiches, or laughter filled the air. These descriptive elements make the language more vivid and memorable. Plus, storytelling podcasts often have a slower pace compared to conversation-based ones, making them easier to follow. And just like you mentioned earlier, learners can use transcripts to follow along if they find certain parts difficult. Priya, do you think podcasts that focus on interviews offer something unique?
Absolutely, Ryan. Interview-based podcasts are fantastic because they expose learners to multiple speakers, which is crucial for adapting to different accents, tones, and speech patterns. For example, an episode might feature a host with an American accent interviewing a guest with a British accent, giving listeners a chance to hear how the same language can sound slightly different. These podcasts are also great for picking up formal and professional language, especially when the interviews cover topics like business, technology, or culture. And let's not forget that interviews often include phrases like, "Could you elaborate on that?" Or, "That's a great question," which are really useful in professional and academic settings. Ryan, any final thoughts on balancing these different types of podcasts?
Yeah, Priya. I'd say the key is balance and variety. Start with learner-focused podcasts to build a solid foundation, then gradually introduce general interest, storytelling, and interview podcasts to challenge yourself and keep things interesting. Remember, the goal is to expose yourself to as much natural language as possible while still feeling like you're learning at your own pace. And don't forget to choose topics that genuinely interest you, whether it's travel, technology, or even comedy. When you enjoy what you're listening to, it hardly feels like studying. All right, Priya, now that we've covered the types of podcasts learners can explore, let's shift gears and talk about strategies, how to actually use podcasts effectively for language learning. You know, one common mistake people make is just passively listening without a clear plan. Don't get me wrong, there's value in having podcasts play in the background while you're doing other things. But if you really want to make progress, you need to go beyond that and engage actively. For example, I always recommend having a notebook or app handy to jot down new words and phrases. That way, you're not just hearing the language, you're actively processing and remembering it. Priya, what's your take on this?
I completely agree, Ryan. Active listening is such a game changer. One technique I always suggest to learners is to listen to a podcast episode more than once, but with a different focus each time. For instance, during the first listen, just focus on understanding the general meaning of the conversation. Don't worry about catching every word. Then, on the second listen, try to focus on specific details, like vocabulary, sentence structures, or even the tone and pronunciation of certain phrases. And here's a pro tip. If the podcast provides a transcript, use it. You can follow along while listening to clarify anything you might have missed. Ryan, do you think there's value in pausing and replaying sections to improve comprehension?
Absolutely, Priya. Pausing and replaying is one of the most effective strategies out there, especially for improving comprehension and pronunciation. For example, if there's a sentence you don't quite understand, you can rewind and listen to it a few times to pick out the key words. And here's where shadowing comes in. It's a technique where you repeat what you hear, trying to mimic the speaker's tone, rhythm, and pronunciation as closely as possible. It might feel awkward at first, but it's incredibly effective for building speaking confidence and fluency. Plus, it helps you internalize the natural flow of the language. Priya, what other strategies do you think can help learners stay engaged while listening?
Great question, Ryan. One way to stay engaged is to turn podcast listening into an interactive experience. For example, learners can pause after a question is asked in the podcast and try to answer it themselves before continuing. This works especially well with interview-based or conversational podcasts. Another strategy is to create flashcards for new vocabulary you pick up. There are apps like Anki or Quizlet where you can easily make digital flashcards and review them later. And for learners who enjoy writing, they can even try summarizing the episode in their own words. This reinforces comprehension and helps with writing skills. Ryan, do you think multitasking while listening is helpful, or does it take away from the learning experience?
That's a great point, Priya, and it really depends on the learner's goal. Multitasking can be helpful for getting extra exposure to the language, like listening during a commute or while doing chores. It's a great way to stay consistent and build a habit. But if you're aiming for deep learning, you need focused listening sessions where you're giving the podcast your full attention. Here's a tip. Set aside 20 to 30 minutes of undistracted time to really dive into the episode, take notes, and replay sections. Then, you can use multitasking time for re-listening to episodes you've already heard to reinforce what you've learned. Priya, how do you think learners can track their progress with podcasts?
Tracking progress is so important, Ryan, and there are a few simple ways to do it. First, learners can keep a journal where they write down new words, phrases, or idioms they've learned from each episode. Over time, they'll see how much vocabulary they've built up. Another way is to set specific goals, like listening to one episode a week and summarizing it, or learning 10 new words per episode. And here's something fun. Record yourself speaking or summarizing what you've learned. Then, after a few weeks, listen back to see how much your pronunciation and fluency have improved. It's such a motivational boost to hear your own progress. Ryan, any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, Priya. I'd just say that the key to using podcasts effectively is to combine active and passive listening, set clear goals, and be consistent. Podcasts are such a flexible tool. You can adapt them to suit your learning style, whether that's taking detailed notes, shadowing, or just enjoying a casual listen. And don't forget to celebrate the small wins along the way, like understanding a tricky phrase or being able to use a new word in conversation. All right, let's keep the momentum going. In this segment, we're going to talk about how to integrate podcasts into your overall study routine. You know, Priya, a lot of people struggle with consistency when it comes to language learning. They might listen to a podcast once in a while, but they don't make it a regular habit. That's where building a solid routine comes in. When you plan your podcast listening as part of your study schedule, it becomes a powerful tool rather than just a casual activity. What's your take on this, Priya?
Exactly, Ryan. One of the first steps is to decide when and where you'll listen to podcasts. It's all about creating a consistent habit. For example, some people like to listen during their commute, while others prefer a quiet space at home where they can really focus. I'd suggest blocking out specific times in your schedule, maybe 15 to 30 minutes a day. And here's a tip. Pair podcasts with another activity you already do regularly, like exercising, cooking, or even walking. This helps you build the habit without feeling like it's extra work. But Ryan, what do you think about combining podcast listening with other study methods?
I think that's such a smart approach, Priya. Podcasts are most effective when they're part of a larger study routine. For instance, after listening to a podcast episode, you can follow up by practicing the vocabulary or grammar you heard using a language app or workbook. Or if the podcast has a transcript, you can use it for reading practice. Highlight unfamiliar words and look them up, then try to use them in sentences of your own. Another great method is to pair podcasts with speaking practice. For example, if you're part of a language exchange or conversation group, you can bring up something interesting you heard in the podcast as a discussion topic. Priya, do you think it's helpful to set goals specifically tied to podcast learning?
Absolutely, Ryan. Setting goals gives you something concrete to work toward, which keeps you motivated. For example, you might set a goal to listen to 3 episodes a week and learn 10 new words from each one. Or maybe your goal is to summarize each episode in your own words, either in writing or by speaking out loud. These goals don't have to be huge. Even small, consistent steps add up over time. And another idea is to use podcasts to tackle specific areas of weakness. For instance, if someone struggles with pronunciation, they can choose podcasts where the hosts speak slowly and clearly and focus on mimicking their intonation and accent. Ryan, how do you think learners can stay flexible while sticking to a routine?
That's a great question, Priya. Flexibility is key because everyone has different schedules and learning preferences. One way to stay consistent without feeling overwhelmed is to set minimum and maximum goals. For example, commit to listening to at least 1 episode a week, but aim for 3 if you have time. This way, you're not pressuring yourself, but still making progress. Another tip is to have a mix of short and long episodes in your playlist. On busy days, you can listen to a 10-minute episode, and on days when you have more time, you can go for a 30 or 40-minute one. Priya, do you think learners benefit more from structured routines or a more relaxed approach?
It really depends on the learner, Ryan. Some people thrive on structure. They like to plan everything, from which podcast to listen to the specific skills they'll focus on. Others prefer a more relaxed approach where they just listen whenever they feel like it. Both methods can work, as long as there's consistency. For example, a relaxed learner might make a habit of listening during their commute every morning without worrying too much about taking notes. On the other hand, a structured learner might dedicate 30 minutes every evening to listening actively and writing down new vocabulary. The key is to find what works for you and stick with it. Ryan, do you have any final tips for making podcasts a regular part of a study routine?
Yeah, Priya. I'd say the most important thing is to make podcasts enjoyable and sustainable. Choose topics you're genuinely interested in, so listening doesn't feel like a chore. And remember, it's okay to mix things up. Some days you might listen actively and take notes, while other days you just relax and let the language wash over you. The point is to keep showing up and making podcasts a consistent part of your language learning journey. All right, Priya, so far we've talked about how amazing podcasts can be for language learning and how to integrate them into a study routine. But let's be honest, there are definitely challenges that learners face when using podcasts as a tool. One of the biggest complaints I hear is that podcasts can sometimes feel overwhelming, especially when the hosts speak too quickly or use unfamiliar vocabulary. It's easy to get frustrated when you don't understand everything right away. But the good news is, there are ways to overcome this. What do you think, Priya? How can learners deal with the challenge of fast speech?
Great question, Ryan. One simple yet effective solution is to use the playback speed feature on your podcast app. Most apps allow you to slow down the speed to 0.75x or even 0.5x, which makes it much easier to follow along. Slowing down the audio gives your brain more time to process what's being said, and it can really help when you're just starting out. Another strategy is to focus on catching key words rather than trying to understand every single word. For example, if the host is talking about travel, listen for words like airport, destination, or luggage to get the main idea. Ryan, what's another challenge you've seen learners face with podcasts?
Good point, Priya. Another big challenge is vocabulary overload, when there are so many unfamiliar words that it feels impossible to keep up. The key here is not to get discouraged. You don't need to understand every single word to benefit from the podcast. Start by focusing on the context and the general meaning of what's being said. If you hear a word repeatedly and it seems important, write it down and look it up later. And here's a tip. Many podcasts for learners offer transcripts. Use them to follow along and highlight new words. Then review those words later in a more relaxed setting. Priya, do you think accents or dialects can also be a barrier for learners?
Absolutely, Ryan. Accents and dialects can be really challenging, especially for beginners who are used to hearing only one type of English, like American or British. But here's the thing. Exposure to different accents is actually a good thing because it prepares you for real-life conversations. If you're struggling with an unfamiliar accent, start with podcasts where the hosts speak clearly and slowly. Once you're comfortable, gradually branch out to podcasts with a variety of accents. Another tip is to repeat challenging sections multiple times. Listening to the same part a few times can help you get used to the accent and understand the speaker's rhythm and intonation. Ryan, what's your advice for learners who feel discouraged when they don't understand everything?
That's such an important point, Priya. Feeling discouraged is normal, especially in the beginning, but it's important to focus on the progress you're making, not the gaps in your understanding. Celebrate the small wins, like understanding a single sentence or recognizing a new word without needing to look it up. Another way to build confidence is to re-listen to old episodes after a few weeks or months. You'll be surprised at how much more you understand the second time around. It's a great reminder that you are improving, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Priya, do you think perfectionism is another challenge learners need to overcome?
Absolutely, Ryan. Perfectionism can really hold learners back. Many people feel like they need to understand every word or get everything right on the first try, but that's just not realistic. Language learning is a process, and it's okay to make mistakes or not understand something right away. Instead of aiming for perfection, focus on making progress. Remember, even native speakers don't know every word or phrase. They rely on context just like learners do. One way to overcome perfectionism is to set achievable goals, like understanding the main idea of a podcast instead of every detail. Ryan, any final tips for overcoming challenges before we wrap up this segment?
Yeah, Priya. I'd say the most important thing is to stay patient and consistent. Podcasts are an incredible tool, but they're just one part of the language learning journey. The key is to keep showing up, even when it feels tough. Use tools like playback speed, transcripts, and repetition to make the process easier, and don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. Every little bit of effort adds up over time. All right, Priya, now that we've tackled some of the common challenges learners face, let's talk about one of the most exciting aspects of podcasts: cultural exposure. You know, learning a language isn't just about grammar and vocabulary, it's also about understanding the culture behind the language. And podcasts are a fantastic way to do that. Whether it's hearing about traditions, current events, or even everyday life, podcasts can give learners a glimpse into the world of native speakers. Priya, why do you think cultural exposure is so important in language learning?
Great question, Ryan. Cultural exposure is key because language and culture are deeply connected. When you understand the culture behind the language, you can communicate more naturally and effectively. For example, you might learn phrases or idioms in a podcast that reflect cultural values or humor. Take the phrase, break the ice. It's not just about understanding the words, it's about knowing when and how to use it in a conversation. Podcasts often cover topics like food, holidays, or social customs, which give you insights into how people live and think. Ryan, do you have an example of how podcasts can bring culture to life for learners?
Absolutely, Priya. Let's say you're listening to a podcast about Thanksgiving in the United States. The hosts might talk about the history of the holiday, the traditional foods like turkey and pumpkin pie, and even the family dynamics that come into play. This kind of cultural context helps you understand not just the words, but the traditions and emotions tied to them. Another example is podcasts about daily life, like commuting or grocery shopping. You'll hear phrases like grabbing a coffee to go or waiting in line at the checkout, which reflect cultural habits. And these aren't things you'd typically learn from a textbook. Priya, how do you think learners can use cultural insights from podcasts in their conversations?
That's such a good point, Ryan. Learners can use cultural insights to make their conversations more engaging and relatable. For example, if someone listens to a podcast about British culture, they might learn about the importance of tea or the phrase a cuppa. Then, when they're talking to a British speaker, they can bring it up as a conversation starter. Something like, "I heard in a podcast that tea is a big part of British culture. Is that true?" This shows not only language skills, but also an interest in the other person's culture, which is a great way to build connections. Ryan, do you think podcasts also help with understanding humor and sarcasm, which are often tied to culture?
Absolutely, Priya. Humor and sarcasm are such important parts of communication, but they can be tricky to learn because they're so culture-specific. Podcasts are a great way to get familiar with these subtleties. For example, comedy podcasts or casual conversations often include jokes, puns, or sarcastic remarks. By listening closely, learners can start to pick up on the tone and context that signal humor. It's also a safe space to learn. If you don't understand a joke, you can rewind and figure it out without any pressure. Priya, what's your advice for learners who want to dive deeper into cultural topics through podcasts?
That's a great question, Ryan. I'd suggest exploring niche podcasts that focus on specific cultural aspects. For example, if you're interested in American culture, look for podcasts about baseball, Hollywood, or American holidays. If British culture fascinates you, try podcasts that discuss British history, accents, or even afternoon tea traditions. These niche topics give you a deeper understanding of the culture and expose you to specialized vocabulary. And don't forget, many podcasts feature interviews with people from different backgrounds, which adds even more cultural diversity. Ryan, any final thoughts before we wrap up this segment?
Yeah, Priya. I'd just say that cultural exposure is one of the most rewarding parts of using podcasts for language learning. It helps you go beyond the basics and really connect with the language on a deeper level. Whether it's through humor, traditions, or everyday habits, understanding culture makes your learning experience richer and more enjoyable. Now that we've explored the cultural side of podcasts, let's dive into the practical tools and apps that make finding and using podcasts easier. Priya, there are so many apps out there, and the right one can really enhance your learning experience. Some apps are built specifically for language learners, while others are more general podcast platforms. A good place to start is with apps like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. These are user-friendly and have massive libraries of podcasts across all kinds of topics. But what's great about them, Priya, is that they often come with features like playback speed control and offline downloads. What's your favorite app for learners?
Great point, Ryan. While the big platforms like Spotify are fantastic, I also recommend apps specifically designed for language learners. One of my favorites is LingQ. It's a language learning app that integrates podcasts and transcripts, allowing learners to listen and read at the same time. Another great option is Duolingo podcasts, which are short, engaging episodes tailored to learners, often featuring bilingual narration. These podcasts are perfect for beginners because they provide translations and explanations as part of the episode. And then there's TED Audio Collective, which offers insightful talks on a variety of topics. Ryan, do you think learners benefit from podcast apps with community features?
Absolutely, Priya. Apps with community features can be a game changer for learners. For example, Reddit or Facebook groups dedicated to podcasts often have discussions where people share their favorite episodes, talk about what they learned, or even practice writing in the target language. Another great app is Hello Talk, which isn't a podcast app, but allows learners to connect with native speakers. Imagine listening to a podcast episode, then discussing it with someone who speaks the language natively. That's practical learning at its best. Priya, what about apps that offer offline features? How do you think those help learners?
That's a great question, Ryan. Offline features are so important, especially for people who want to learn on the go. Imagine you're on a long flight or in a place with limited internet access. Being able to download podcast episodes in advance ensures you never miss a learning opportunity. Apps like Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Overcast let you download episodes for offline listening. Another app I love is Audible, which offers audiobook-style podcasts. They're perfect for intermediate and advanced learners who want to challenge themselves with longer content. Ryan, do you think learners should experiment with different apps? Or is it better to stick to one?
I'd say a bit of both, Priya. Starting with one app is great for building consistency and familiarity, but exploring different options can open up new possibilities. For example, an app like Podbean is excellent for discovering niche podcasts, while Stitcher offers curated playlists that match your interests. And some apps like Speechify or Otter.ai even let you convert text into audio or generate transcripts from any podcast, which is super helpful for studying. My advice would be to try out a few apps and settle on the ones that best meet your learning goals. Priya, what's your take on using apps that integrate other learning features, like flashcards or notes?
That's a fantastic point, Ryan. Apps that integrate multiple features are perfect for reinforcing what you've learned. For example, LingQ, which I mentioned earlier, lets you create vocabulary flashcards directly from podcast transcripts. Another great app is Anki, where you can manually input new words and phrases you hear in podcasts to review them later. Some apps like Quizlet even allow you to create study sets based on podcast topics. And don't overlook simple tools like your phone's Notes app. It's a great place to jot down new words or phrases you want to practice. Ryan, any final recommendations before we move to the next segment?
Yeah, Priya. I'd just add that the key is to find the tools that work best for your learning style. Whether it's a big platform like Spotify or a specialized app like LingQ, the goal is to make podcast listening as easy and enjoyable as possible. Take advantage of features like offline downloads, transcripts, and flashcards to maximize your learning. In this segment, we're going to share some real-life success stories of language learners who've used podcasts to achieve their goals. Priya, I think success stories are such a great way to inspire listeners. They show what's possible and give practical ideas for how to make the most of podcasts. I'll start with one story I came across recently. There's a French learner named Sarah who shared her journey online. She started listening to beginner-friendly French podcasts for just 15 minutes a day. Over time, she worked her way up to advanced-level shows. What made the biggest difference for her was using the transcripts to learn vocabulary and practicing shadowing. Priya, do you have a favorite success story?
Absolutely, Ryan. One of my favorite stories is about a learner named Diego from Mexico who wanted to improve his English for work. He started listening to business-focused podcasts like The Indicator and How I Built This. At first, he found it hard to follow the fast pace and technical terms, but he didn't give up. He used the playback speed feature to slow down the episodes and made flashcards for the key phrases he wanted to learn. Within 6 months, Diego noticed a huge improvement in his listening skills and confidence. He even started using the phrases he learned in meetings and presentations. It's amazing what consistency can do, isn't it, Ryan?
It really is, Priya. Consistency is such a powerful tool, and Diego's story is a perfect example of that. I also heard about a German learner named Tom who used podcasts to prepare for a trip to Germany. He listened to travel-related podcasts in German, focusing on common phrases and cultural tips. What really helped him was repeating key sentences out loud and practicing with a language partner. By the time he arrived in Germany, he could navigate conversations at cafes, train stations, and even small talk with locals. He said podcasts made him feel more prepared and confident than any other resource he tried. Priya, do you think success stories like these can help learners stay motivated?
Absolutely, Ryan. Hearing these stories reminds learners that progress is possible, even if it feels slow at times. One story that stands out to me is about a learner named Hana, who wanted to improve her listening skills in Japanese. She struggled with understanding native-level podcasts, but found a way to make it work by listening in chunks. Instead of trying to understand a full episode, she focused on 5-minute segments and wrote down every phrase she could catch. Over time, her ability to understand longer episodes improved dramatically. And here's the best part. She said that podcasts made her feel connected to the culture, which kept her motivated to keep learning. Ryan, any advice for listeners who want to create their own success story?
That's a great question, Priya. I'd say the first step is to set realistic goals and track your progress. Start with podcasts that match your current level and don't be afraid to revisit episodes multiple times. Use tools like transcripts, flashcards, and shadowing to reinforce what you learn. And most importantly, be patient with yourself. Progress might feel slow, but every time you listen, you're improving your understanding and getting one step closer to your goal. Priya, any final thoughts before we move to the next segment?
I'd just add that everyone's language learning journey is unique, so don't compare yourself to others. Instead, use success stories as inspiration to find what works best for you. Remember, podcasts are a flexible tool that you can adapt to your own needs and interests. So whether you're learning for work, travel, or just for fun, stick with it. You'll be amazed at what you can achieve.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from understanding how podcasts aid language, learning to strategies, tools, and even real-life success stories. In this final segment, we're going to wrap things up and share some actionable takeaways that you can start using right away. Priya, let's kick things off by summarizing the main points. What do you think are the biggest benefits of using podcasts for language learning?
Great question, Ryan. For me, the biggest benefit is how podcasts provide natural, real-world language exposure. They help learners improve listening comprehension, build vocabulary, and get comfortable with different accents and speech patterns. Another huge advantage is the cultural insights you gain, whether it's learning about traditions, humor, or everyday habits. And of course, podcasts are incredibly flexible. You can listen anywhere, anytime, and even multitask while learning. What about you, Ryan? What do you think learners should remember most about using podcasts?
Great points, Priya. I'd say the most important thing is to be consistent and intentional with your podcast listening. Start with podcasts that match your level, and don't be afraid to use tools like transcripts and playback speed controls to make things easier. Also, make it a habit. Schedule regular listening sessions and set small, achievable goals, like learning 5 new words per episode or summarizing what you heard. And remember, it's not about understanding everything right away. Progress takes time, and every little step counts. Priya, do you have any final tips for our listeners?
Definitely, Ryan. My final tip would be to choose podcasts that genuinely interest you. Whether it's travel, business, or storytelling, when you enjoy what you're listening to, learning becomes a lot more fun and effective. Also, try to actively engage with the content. Take notes, shadow the speakers, or discuss what you've learned with a friend or language partner. And don't forget to celebrate your progress. Whether it's understanding a new phrase or finishing a full episode without getting lost, every achievement is worth celebrating. Ryan, how about we leave our listeners with a challenge?
Great idea, Priya. All right, here's our challenge for you. Over the next week, choose one podcast episode in your target language and listen to it twice. The first time, focus on the general meaning. The second time, pick out 5 new words or phrases and try using them in sentences. Bonus points if you share what you learned with a friend or in a language learning group. Priya, any final words before we sign off?
Just one, Ryan. Keep going. Language learning is a journey, and podcasts are one of the best tools to make that journey exciting and rewarding. Remember, consistency and curiosity are your best friends. So start exploring podcasts, experiment with different strategies, and most importantly, enjoy the process. We're here to cheer you on every step of the way.
And with that, we're wrapping up today's episode of Speak Up. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you found this discussion helpful and inspiring. We'll be back soon with another topic to help you on your language learning journey.